All right, so one fight flow that is not happening. TJ Dillashaw, Demetrious Johnson, and you can count me among the disappointed. Dwayne Bang Ludwig had some good things to say on the MMA hour last week about why this fight had such appeal for him. He sees TJ Dillashaw as this all-time greatest bantamweight of all time. He sees Demetrious Johnson similarly at 125 pounds, and I don't know exactly why this didn't come together. Perhaps DJ's demands were too great financially. He did have shoulder surgery in January, so perhaps the calendar didn't align. But Kenny, I'm disappointed, man. I thought this fight was going to happen maybe July 7th, and if you take Dana White at his word, it doesn't seem like this one's going to go down.
Jeez, again, this is a fight that I was looking forward to. Obviously, we had TJ Dillashaw on the show, and, it seemed like it was going to happen. Now, here's the thing. Is this one of these fights that isn't going to happen like Bisping and GSP wasn't going to happen? You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't know. Like, is this a negotiating tactic of saying, hey, this is now off the table to get one of these fighters to come back and go, okay, listen, let's do it. I don't know, but I'm sure that a lot of people are frustrated, myself included, that this fight isn't going to happen. Super fights are rare. Super fights are rare, and the UFC had an opportunity, I think, to put on a couple super fights. We had the Stipe Miocic Daniel Cormier fight, like that's the date I believe that they were looking at, and to have another kind of super fight with Dillashaw and Demetrious Johnson. And possible Amanda Nunes Cyborg fight.
Right.
They really could have delivered a blockbuster main card, with those three title fights, which are truly super fights, which we haven't really seen in the UFC. I think there's only been really a couple of those. There was the GSP BJ Penn. I think that was a super fight. As far as, guys coming together from two different weight classes that everybody wanted to see, guys that people thought were, GOAT candidates.
Florian Alexis.
That's huge. That of course, that was, obviously we wanted to see the Anderson Silva GSP fight for a long time. That didn't come to fruition. So it's tough to put these fights together. And again, I think this is just more of a business decision on the parts of the fighters and the UFC that just wasn't able to make it happen at this time. I think it's a fight that I think will happen. And I hope it does happen. I hope it happens in the near future. Maybe they could pull this back together, man. Who knows?
It wouldn't seem like it wouldn't seem like we would see Demetrious Johnson before July anyway. So who knows if this is just public posturing or what it is. But in terms of a next opponent for TJ Dillashaw, Kenny, and again, we had him on the show recently. You heard his thoughts on Cody Garbrandt and Dominic Cruz. And TJ said it's not as though the Garbrandt rematch doesn't have value or legs. The timing wasn't going to be right for us to do it back at UFC 222 earlier this month. Jimmy Rivera has a fight on June 1st already scheduled, which is 2.5 months away. So here's this guy who's won like 38 fights in a row, and he has that main event against Marlon Moraes. And if Jimmy Rivera is going to be the next guy for Dillashaw, that's not going to be until late in the year, right? So that's going to be what amounts to a year-long layoff for TJ Dillashaw, if not longer. No, longer. So I don't know, Flo. I mean, do you think it's going to be Garbrandt or Cruz now for Dillashaw? Like, if it's not DJ, I got to think they want to make a bantamweight championship fight, and those would be the two names that would be out there.
I would think so. I think Garbrandt and Cruz are the candidates right now that make the most sense timing-wise. Obviously, you just mentioned what Jimmy Rivera has coming up June 1st. And geez, I mean, that's an amazing fight as well. Moraes, are you kidding me? And Rivera, in some instances, I wonder if the UFC is saying, listen, for TJ, you still have unfinished business at 135 pounds. Look at all the contenders that are out there. There's still a lot of great fights at 135 pounds. The Garbrandt rematch, I think a lot of people would like to see happen. I know Dillashaw won that fight early in the second round, but I think it's a fight that still makes a lot of sense. I could watch those guys fight all day, and the hype leading up to it is tremendous. Dominic Cruz, obviously. I think TJ Dillashaw would probably want revenge. It seemed like he kind of didn't want that fight.
Right.
In some ways, I think it's because it's a very difficult fight for him.
Yeah.
Anytime you fight a Dominic Cruz, it's going to be tricky, okay? You're not going to go out there and just – it's not an easy game plan for someone like Dominic Cruz. So I think that's probably what has TJ Dillashaw a little hesitant. Of course, Dominic lost his last fight, so in his mind, he's like, yeah, what do I have to gain? But, I mean, Dominic beat him in that first round. I know it was a close fight. It really could have gone either way. I thought they were going to give the nod to TJ maybe, but it was a close fight. And I think for TJ, you got to be thinking, listen, I want revenge. I want to show that I can beat Dominic. And it seems like he doesn't want that fight. But there were a lot of great fights in that division. Moraes and Rivera going at it. He still has, to fight the winner of that would be huge and interesting. So, there's no shortage of fights at 135 pounds. There are shortage of fights at 125 pounds. I mean, who does DJ fight next if he doesn't fight Dillashaw?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think Henry Cejudo would probably be the guy. I mean, Joseph Benavidez and Sergio Pettis have a date this summer, but Benavidez certainly is closer to a title fight than Pettis, who is now coming off that loss to Cejudo. But you're right. I mean, I think that's also a big picture part of the issue, right, is that the fight for DJ right now, I think, is TJ. And unfortunately, despite that timing seeming to be good, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Well, we'll see. A lot of interesting possibilities. I remember I requested a sit down with Big John McCarthy because I was so convinced. Well, not so convinced, but I was convinced that Dillashaw had beaten Dominic Cruz in that fight. And I thought Carlos Condit beat Robbie Lawler at UFC 195.
Yeah.
So I asked to meet with John McCarthy so he could explain to me why I was wrong on both accounts, and he did so. He said that Cruz and Lawler respectively won those two fights. But
it's up to. But that's the thing is this, and I respect Big John McCarthy. The guy knows his stuff. Upside down, left and right, backwards and forwards. But it's still an opinion at the end of the day.
Yes.
You know what I mean? There's so it's
right. And me, like when there's a close fight, there are two or three that I seek out, and yours is foremost among them, right? Am I crazy in thinking that Carlos Condit won that fight? But yeah.
And just to go back to the Cejudo Demetrious Johnson thing, I think that's a great fight. But if Demetrious Johnson wants more money, right? If he wants more money, he has the choice of fighting Dillashaw, which is going to bring him more money, I think. I don't know what the base salary is, but if it goes to pay-per-view, I would think they would have a piece of the pie, right? I would assume.
Right.
That's going to bring him a lot more money than a rematch against Henry Cejudo, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no,
so
I really
don't know. Yeah, it's
what
a
the holdup
situation.
is. It's if I had to guess, it's that the demands for the guaranteed money from DJ and or TJ is not dovetailing with what the UFC's bottom line is for that fight. So we shall see if it plays out. And of course, too, when it comes to serving masters, right? Nunes Cyborg for July, sure, but we've got this master known as UFC 224 coming up on May 12th that needed a headliner, and Amanda Nunes is going to do it against Raquel Pennington there. So in terms of the money, Dustin Poirier had an interesting quote. I think MMAJunkie.com had the piece. And here's the quote from Poirier. I don't know how many contracts I've had with the UFC, but this is my first one with championship language in it. We have a plan figured out for when I win the belt, and it's in my contract. This is my first contract with that in it, and I've had a lot of contracts with the UFC. This is the closest I've ever come to being a world champion, and everything is happening like clockwork, like it's supposed to. Kenny, you 3 times fought for a UFC championship, so obviously a lot of your contracts had championship language in it. Why is Poirier getting championship language now? Is it because he got to a certain ranking? I know how highly the promotion thinks of him, but why all of a sudden now and not maybe in the previous contract when he was still entrenched? I mean, this is a guy who had a fight against Conor McGregor. Why now, do you think, for Dustin to get that type of contract language? Any idea?
Well, I would say, it definitely has something to do with his ranking. I think it has to do with the fact that the UFC probably believes that he could fight for the belt in the future and become a champion in the future. And I think that, when I had that in my contract, that was very motivating to me. That made me work that much harder, that there is a goal now, that there is, also just the fact that there's a monetary compensation that goes with becoming a champion now. It takes you to a whole different level. It doesn't guarantee you that money, right? I mean, he still needs to be a belt holder in order to probably get perhaps a pay-per-view percentage that they were probably talking about in his contract. So, but either way, it's very motivating and it's very rewarding as well that the organization sees you in that light, that you have the opportunity to possibly get that. And I think that's great news for Dustin, man.
Yeah, he deserves it. He's headlined a lot for the UFC against the Korean Zombie, Michael Johnson, recently, of course, against Anthony Showtime Pettis. And, when he was on our show, as I mentioned, he said Khabib Nurmagomedov is the toughest fight for him at 155 pounds. maybe Poirier's a guy you'd throw into that mix if you had to pick someone to beat Khabib, but I'm not sure, at least right now, that you would pick him over Tony Ferguson. All right, I'm breaking a promise to myself. There were two things I was not going to talk about today, and one of them was Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather. So I did a lot of media last week, and a lot of it was because of the McGregor-Mayweather talk.
Octagon News.